This is Christopher Schreck.
And I'm Landon Metz. Welcome back to the Abundant Zine podcast.
Today, we're speaking with Rebekka Bay, a creative director whose work merges commercial strategy, artistic sensibility, and communal ideals.
Rebekka studied art history and spent time in trend forecasting and branding before turning her focus to fashion. After overseeing the launch of Cause in 2007, she held top positions at companies like The Gap, Bruins Bazaar, and Uniqlo before joining the Finnish lifestyle brand Marimekko in 2020.
In her new role as creative director, Rebekka draws on Marimekko's 72-year heritage while taking a concept-driven approach to technical innovation, sustainability, and community building. Along the way, she's worked with a range of notable artists and designers on collaborative projects, including Landon, who recently worked with Marimekko on an exclusive set of garments and accessories as part of their latest spring-summer collection.
We recorded this sponsored episode live at Marimekko's space at 97 Wooster in New York, where we spoke with Rebekka about her unconventional career path, her unique approach to creative direction, and the long-standing bond between fashion and art.
Thanks for listening.
How's it going?
Good, thank you.
Your journey into fashion was somewhat unconventional, certainly not a straight line. So you studied art in undergrad, you attended design and tailoring schools, and spent several years in branding and trend forecasting before being approached by H&M to develop what became Cause. I think we'd be curious to learn how each of those steps led to the next one and why you ultimately decided to focus on fashion.
But I never decided to focus on fashion. I always thought that I wanted to work within the arts, but more sort of a commercial approach. I really like this idea of communicating or connecting people. So I studied art history because I sort of wanted to have a formal way in, but I wanted to take it somewhere else. And I think in Denmark at the time, I didn't know that you could work in journalism focusing on art, or I didn't really know what the options were, so it felt natural. But then very shortly into that, it didn't feel so natural. I was like, it's too academia, and I care more for the creation, but at the time I had no idea what the creation was. And I think I was always fighting against this idea of working in fashion. So the sort of ending up in fashion was much more of a coincidence. I think it's like, maybe I should learn a trade. And then I thought, maybe tailoring is a trade. And my dad is a photographer. So I think this sort of understanding the craft was important to me. At tailoring school, maybe it's more fashion than trade for you. And I applied to design school, but already knowing that I really didn't want to work in fashion. I didn't want to design. Again, I really wanted to communicate, and I was really interested in the process and where we're coming from, or why are we responding in certain ways, or why does something resonate with everyone at the same time. I was really curious about this sort of the zeitgeist. So I sort of interviewed with the fashion school. You do a portfolio, you do a 3-day test, and you do an interview. And I told them in my interviews, I really, really, really don't want to design collections. This is during the time of the Antwerp 6 and of Comme des Garçons and Yamamoto and Issey Miyake. And I was like, I have nothing to add. I have nothing to add to the world of fashion. But I was really keen on figuring out what could be my path.
Why were you so opposed to designing or working in fashion? What was that threshold that you didn't want to cross?
I don't think I was opposed to working in fashion. I think I was opposed to making a life as a creative, because I've grown up with my father, who has been, who had to sacrifice at times his creativity for commerciality, or who always had the creative part of being a photographer as a side to his professional job. So I think I was so concerned in ending up in this conflict.
Did your father have a personal, private photo practice that he considered his art?
Yes. He actually, it's very interesting. My dad actually worked for a museum photographing sculptures and paintings. So he would produce, art books and exhibition catalog. He trained as a portrait photographer, so he had his own atelier at that time. And he has always been photographing landscapes and sort of more abstract landscapes. So he has continued his own practice. Now he's retired and now he's doing that a lot. But I just think I always saw him sort of in this conflict between what he needed to do and what he wanted to do. And I really didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be a starving artist. I wanted to sort of have, I think I felt the need to have the academia in place as well. So it wasn't fashion as such. I always cared a ton for fashion. I think I was in the little town where I grew up, like a town of 60,000 people. I think I was always ahead of the curve. So I was never on trend because I think I was always ahead of trend. I was like always looking for the next.
But you were picking up on some sort of creative impulse or intuition that was happening around you. Your sensors were activated and you were feeling it. You had a capacity to translate something in your environment into a singular kind of decision-making process, which is a creative gesture, which also requires a sort of a choice. I mean, in a way, you're acting like an artist in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's also why I then ended up focusing on color and trend forecast. It's really also trusting your intuition or your instinct and turning that into a singular vision and sort of standing behind that and not. I don't think when you work in forecast and now as a creative director, I cannot question my instinct. So, or if I would start questioning my instinct, how can I then lead design teams or teams at a larger scale?
It's funny, I think we talked about this one of the first times we ever met, which is like a lot of what you're saying resonates with me about being an artist. I feel we kind of just move through the world. We live our lives. We have our families and our people and our communities and all the things we have to do and want to do and whatever. In the process of doing all that, you sort of accumulate a lot of life and you translate that into a kind of a intuitive decision-making process. And the work that results from your sort of like bodily filter is your singular vision, and how you choose to translate that, how you choose to communicate and disseminate whatever that is ultimately kind of coming from the same creative impulse. And I feel like in a very strange way, you did choose the life of an artist, or it was just kind of your natural state. You operate in a way that's very familiar to me as someone who makes things.
And I think you're absolutely right. At least I think in our conversations that there's so many similarities to how we approach the work, the process, the medium. I think the bigger difference is I never chose it. It sort of just happened. I sort of just landed in this, and maybe I also just stopped questioning, like what's the next or what's the next. It's sort of one thing led to another, and being sort of extremely curious about how things or processes work. It's fairly easy actually to engage in all these different parts of creative process or creative output, because I'm always coming into that with a question of how are you doing this, or how could we do this, or what's the dialogue. And I think what I see, or at least what I picked up on in our conversations, is that there is a lot of this, like what's the externalizing and internalizing. Yeah, what's the input and what's the output.
I also think the thing that you do that I recognize is you make yourself available to receive those messages, and you put yourself in the vulnerable and empathetic position of telling a story. Choosing to be available and then also choosing to do something with that information, those are two pretty big gestures, and they require a lot of vulnerability and empathy. And there is a kind of stepping aside or opening up, I think, that has to happen on a personal level to make that possible.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Can I ask what your mom did?
Yes, I didn't grow up with my mom, so it hasn't really impacted my life much, but she's a child psychologist. And I'm laughing because it's such a, of course she's a child psychologist.
It's another tragic irony.
Yes.
And your father is still practicing?
My father retired probably 10 years ago. I've never seen him happier because now he takes pictures of what he wants to take pictures of.
Totally. He's an artist.
He's definitely an artist. And he's also, I think back to the choices you make or the choices you don't make. He's probably the proudest of me, because I remember very early in my career, he's like, you actually managed, Rebekka, to be both, very true to yourself and you have so much integrity, but you can also make a living doing that. And I think for him, that was always the struggles. Like, how do you make a living out of what you really want to do?
Do you feel in hindsight that you didn't do the thing that you were trying to not do?
No.
I feel like that's exactly what you've done.
I just think it wasn't such a straight path.
Is it ever a straight path, though?
For some people it is. And I think often, I think a lot of people would view me as very ambitious in everything I do. And often I think there's a misconception that would require that you know exactly where you're heading or how to get there. And for me, that was never part of it. And I think probably to your point, it's also allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to allow things to happen to you and then respond to them. So for me, it was not that straight path. It was much more being not being so scared of entering deep water where I didn't know how to swim, or jumping out of high cliffs. That has never been really scary. Sometimes in the situation, it's been really scary.
Sure.
When you're sitting there and you don't know what's expected from you or what is required. But I think I just always sort of figured out how to still deliver something that was meaningful.
That's unconditional love, right? You're meeting life without prerequisite on the terms that are handed to you, and you choose to let that happen as it does, and you can process it as it comes, but you don't have to hold on to something or an idea of what life should or shouldn't be. You just kind of allow it to come to you.
Yeah.
So you arrived at this role, creative direction. You spent some time at places like Uniqlo, Gap, etc. When did you join Marimekko?
I joined Marimekko September 2020, sort of in the middle of the pandemic.
And so what drew you to Marimekko? Because I think outwardly, one could view it as kind of an interesting choice for you in terms of joining this kind of print-heavy brand with kind of a signature aesthetic and certainly an extensive heritage. What was it for you to come on board and kind of combine your vision with what was already here?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the why Marimekko, I have in all the shifts I've had in my career, I always tried to take on something that was new, something that I had never, where I had not had the experience. So I've always been very concerned with this idea of creating better design for the many. I really believe that good design can make people's life better. I think that's the red thread in everything I've done. I'm always very concerned with this idea of working with brands that are democratic.
Are you a Bauhaus fan?
I'm totally a Bauhaus fan.
Have you read the writings from like Walter Gropius?
Yes, I have. And I'm also very much a Charlotte Perriand fan. I'm very much a Prové fan. I'm a modernist in many ways. For many years, people were sort of always referring to me as a minimalist, which I'm not. I'm not trying to reduce everything to nothing, but I really believe in these democratic values. And I really believe that better design can make people's lives better. So I've always chosen brands based on that. And I definitely have a sort of a weak spot for the really big ones, which is why I have worked for a few of them. But then when the Marimekko opportunity came to me, I had actually been on the board of directors for a while, so I knew the brand. I was used to traveling to Helsinki. I lived in New York at the time. So I was very familiar with the teams and the people and the brand and, of course, the brand history. With 70 years of, I think, radicalism and female empowerment, so there was not a lot in the history of the brand that really resonated with me. I've never worked for a brand with such a strong female heritage as Marimekko, but also I've never had my hands on anything archive. So I helped start a brand. I've worked for brands with sort of shorter history, and with role as a creative director was really just to continue that. With Marimekko, sort of getting my hands on 70 years of print history and more than 3,500 prints. It was a whole new approach to how do you onboard yourself and what do you do with it? What do you do with this strong heritage so that you will definitely focus on the future, on the next 70 years, but also, of course, sort of honor the work that has happened the previous 70.
Yeah, I mean, it puts you in an interesting position because you have to be future focused and yet you have this other responsibility. Having said that, do you feel like it's part of your role to challenge preconceptions about Marimekko or challenge the tastes of your customer base? I
think that's just my role.
That's
not
role.
Even for Marimekko. I think I've always took upon myself to challenge what is, what are convention, what is expected of today, what should we settle for. I think I have this like strong desire to do better or create things of better quality, or also to direct customers to understand why we're doing what we're doing, or the deeper meaning. And I think what's interesting with Marimekko is when you have so much history, there's always this danger that you're just looking backwards, that you're sort of resting a little bit on your laurels or resting on your history. And I felt when I joined Marimekko, but that maybe there was a little bit of that, a little bit of, we'll just dive into the archive and we'll just, repeat the same stories. And you become a little bit of a institution or a museum instead of creating relevance of today. So, of course, the first thing I really concerned myself with is how do we honor these 70 years, but how do we also create something of today, and how, especially if we were to look back on the brand in 70 years from now, how will what we're doing today impact sort of the next 70 years?
Where do you think this desire to challenge comes from within you?
I don't know. I think I have this overly developed, maybe not only positive, but overly developed sense of what's fair and what's good. And
what does fair mean to you?
I think it's probably connected to these sort of democratic values or values of equality and values for not having to settle. And I think at least what I bring into this role is that never really settling, never being happy in the middle. I really hate the middle of everything. I think I like things that are really small or really big, or really quiet or really bold. But I just think the middle, or this mediocre, is such a static and not challenging and boring position to have.
Is there any relationship between Denmark or Scandinavia and that feeling inside of you?
Yeah, I'm sure that being Danish, having received Danish education, having lived in a liberal artistic environment, that of course I think it's been very ingrained in me, this quest for better, a quest for betterment in everything we do. So it's both in how you behave, how you are as a human, how you are as a mother, how you are as a daughter, how you are as a friend, as a creative, as a team leader.
So you feel this desire to challenge is in parallel with the way you've grown up in Scandinavia. It's working in tandem.
Exactly.
It's not opposed to it or going against that grain.
No, definitely not. I know that you know Denmark, or at least Copenhagen, really well. And of course, in Scandinavian culture, or especially Nordic culture, there is this law of Jante, which is very embedded in our culture, which is the opposite maybe of betterment and ambition. But I never grew up in an environment where anyone would push back. I think more the opposite. I think I went to both a school and I grew up in a family where if you wanted to do better, if you wanted to jump off a high cliff, then it was jump, and we will pick you out of the water if you cannot swim.
So you felt some security in the collectivity.
Yes.
And that made you brave?
Over time, I think it made me brave, because I think now I really live by this sort of, if you ask yourself what's the worst thing that can happen, it has to be really bad to be worse. So I think if you can sort of enter into everything with this idea what's the worst thing that can happen, then it's actually not so bad.
Yeah,
so it's not
what's
so
the
dangerous.
best thing that could happen?
Yeah. No, but I think more in terms of this, just putting yourself into situations where you don't know the outcome, but very rarely would it be really bad.
Or you trust the process, you, Rebekka, trust the process. You know that whatever comes your way, you'll trust your intuition to make decisions to help you navigate that in a way that maybe isn't necessarily safe in the moment, but will always guide you back towards some sort of security.
And maybe it's less than, I don't think it's so much about bravery, but I definitely, where I am now, I'm not scared of failing. I'm really good at apologizing. I'm not so scared of also revising my ideas, or, I'm quite happy to be challenged or change direction.
That'll keep you alive longer, probably.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know, but yeah.
I'm looking at pieces from the collection that you made with Landon, and In light of that collection, that's something that Landon and I have been talking about a lot recently, is this sort of long and rich history of fashion labels and fashion designers reimagining artistic works. And I think some of the ones that we've been talking about are like Elsa Schiaparelli, her work with Salvador Dali, or Yves Saint Laurent's adaptations of Mondrian and Matisse, or even more recently, something like Raf Simons and Sterling Ruby. Obviously, Marimekko has worked with outside designers from the start, but what is the brand's history in terms of collaborating with visual artists?
Yeah, so that's actually a quite recent history, and I think something that, of course, and I don't want to make a distinction between our print designers and our artists. It's more the way we work with them that is different. As you're saying, we have a rich archive. We always work with external print designers, and then we have an in-house artwork studio. But this idea of working more directly with artists came from, I think when I joined Marimekko in this role, I felt that as much as we have rich history, maybe we are not always willing to enter into what a true artist collaboration is, or maybe we're not always open, or we have not been open to really understand the process or how to protect the integrity of the artist's process of work and then apply that. So instead of looking at the art just as a two-dimensional pattern that we will then put on top of a garment, I felt there was something in sort of also opening up the collaboration in the process and how to apply the work or how to translate the work. So that is fairly new. Our collaboration with Landon is the second in a series that I hope will continue.
Mm-hmm. Would you say so far there have been any common kind of traits or sensibilities that have tied the artists that you've chosen to work with together?
For the artist collaborations, that is a very intuitive process. It's really, at least currently, it's really me falling in love with something, or me falling in love with the idea of translating that into a garment. So that's very intuitive. Always in my work, I have always been super inspired by, and I want to say the arts, because it is literature and visual arts and sculpture and spatial design, and as much as architecture and furniture design. But that has always been the starting point for everything I do. And it can be an ism, or it can be a chair or a specific artwork. So there's no... there's no rules, and there's nothing that's bigger or smaller. So the artist collaborations are exactly the same. I see art, and especially with Landon's work, I've actually known it. I think always, I cannot remember not knowing Landon's work. So it's something that I have always sort of responded to. But of course, not everything that you are inspired by is applicable to garments. So I think it's also this process where suddenly you look at the art, and it's really interesting, and it's so banal. I was looking at some of your work from a few years back, and suddenly I couldn't see it just as paintings or canvases. Suddenly I could only see collection lineups. So I think I started the translation even before I reached out, because I was like, this is so obvious. It really, it's so applicable. But what was unique here was, for me, not applicable to a piece, but more to this like a lineup, or sort of lining several pieces up.
The way works move through space.
Yes,
how they
exactly.
exist in culture.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the decisions that you made in terms of translating his work on canvas into wearable garments?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there's in garments, there's a three-dimensional piece. So it wraps around a body. Then there's a material, and then there's the artwork itself. Really early, we started to try to figure out how to replicate the way the color is placed on the canvas. The material decision was really easy because we wanted to just replicate the canvas. I love this idea of working on an untreated, unbleached canvas. So we do that as well. So there was a clear connection there. It took us many tries to figure out how to create the color gradation in the print. And then because of Landon's work, what I see is the continuation and the repetition, or the sort of how the pieces are connected. We really wanted to very literally and also more conceptually try to translate that into garments. So we worked with, normally I'm not going to be too detailed here, but normally a dress will have side seams. It will be stitched on the side of the body. But here we decided to move some of the seams to the front or the back to sort of refer back to where the two canvases meet, so really create that. But also we were very interested in placing the artwork around the body, so that when you, again referring back to this lineup, so that if you were to line up several dresses next to each other and they started moving, the artwork would change based on how the dresses would turn.
Everything you're saying is also so in line with my practice already, The way I think about, let's say, an installation of an exhibition is not just the way the paintings move through space, but the work itself is about the way the paintings move in society and culture. And so the way that they accentuate the particularities of their exhibition environment and the sort of echo that has on the viewer and their body and their perception of their physicality within that space, And anything that I can do to create like an awareness of the viewer and their body and the relationship to not just the image, but the way the images are functioning on the object and the way the objects are functioning in the space. And then the way that language is sort of situated within society and how it can be amorphous and how it moves. And so when you reached out to me, and after having conversations with you...
Many.
Sorry. It became very clear that you understood that there was a sensitivity to the way the language can be articulated across different mediums and the way the work is kind of moving through not just literal spaces, but also psychic spaces and how it is situated within culture. And so this jump between like acknowledging the body in an exhibition to someone quite literally moving with their own body through space, wearing the work, and how that can be articulated across multiple garments, and that sort of gap between them becoming like a charged space, And I think that sort of like in between space is really where the sort of that tension between what's there and what's not there is where my work really comes to life. And you guys really, you didn't just like visually recreate that. I think you actually embodied it in the whole project.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that. And I think that is the biggest difference with the artist series, that we're really trying to not just visually recreate something, but really try to understand the practice or the integrity in the work. But then I also think that we, when I say we had many conversations. I think you had many, reservations about what does it mean to apply your work sort of in a more commercial context. But I think we also learned, what I have really enjoyed with this, also that we have so many interests outside of what we do. Totally. So it also became an opportunity to do all these other things together, or to sort of focus on what is spatial design, or what can we do with a collaboration, or where can we take this dialogue?
I think for me, it was, I didn't want the translation to be an aesthetic one. I wanted to be an embodiment of a philosophy and a way of thinking about art and a way of being. And I genuinely believe that you understood that, and all the decisions along the way have reflected that.
But now it will go out and live in the world, and we sort of need to now let it go and be its own thing. But also more and more, working in fashion is also working in innovation. It's really a lot of my time now goes into working with entrepreneurs or new material developers, or figuring out new business models or new production models or how to commercialize and scale new materials. And that is something that's really exciting, because it's also new territory for me. The need for us to understand that to really sort of produce collections in a more responsible ways, we need to figure out not just how to be more sustainable, but we also need to propose to both our consumers and our peers. We need to be in constant dialogue with our peers on how we create a better, more responsible industry. So that is something I'm really excited about, because it's new. There's a lot of learnings for me, but there's also, again, a lot of opportunity to be in dialogue and to be inspired and inspiring others.
What is your relationship to artists? I feel like you have this thing with your father where there's this fear of, or this idea that like dedicating your life to poetry can be risky, that you might get caught in a web that is conflicting. What do you feel about people that choose to do that anyway?
I think that was my fear when I was younger. I think now, in my head, There's not a hierarchy about which arts is more artistic than the others. So now I feel like I'm in this very privileged and comfortable space where I can connect with artists and designers and architects and writers and poets or filmmakers. I think if I were intimidated by the arts or by artists, it would be difficult for us to have these collaborations, so these conversations, because I would then feel that I was coming at it from a more commercial space or a less artistic space. But I think I found peace now and feel very privileged that I have the opportunity to both work on a commercial product, but also connect with something that sort of lives in a different world or in a different reality than the one I'm in.
The Abundant Scene podcast is produced by Ryan Leahy. Our theme music is by Casper Bjork.
You can read and listen to all of our conversations at abundancezine.com. Follow us on Instagram at AbundanceZine, and be sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for listening.